The desert town of Perdition Wells, New Mexico, shimmered in the brutal afternoon heat like a mirage that refused to disappear. It was the kind of place that existed on no official maps, a settlement born from the marriage of necessity and lawlessness, where the railroad met the cattle trails and desperate men made their last stands against fate. The main street was little more than a wide dirt path flanked by false-fronted buildings that looked ready to collapse under the weight of their own ambitions. But appearances were deceiving in Perdition Wells. This was a town that survived by being exactly what travelers needed it to be. Sanctuary or hell, depending on how much money they carried and how many enemies they'd left behind. In the Silver Dollar Saloon, the largest and most prosperous establishment in town, a young man sat alone at a corner table, his back to the wall and his eyes on the door. At 23, Jesse Coulter had already earned a reputation as one of the fastest draws in the territory, but his youthful face still held traces of the idealism that had driven him from his family's farm in Kansas 3 years earlier. His Colt .45 hung low on his right hip, with the casual familiarity of constant use, and the pearl grips were worn smooth by countless hours of practice and more real confrontations than most men faced in a lifetime. Jesse's arrival in Perdition Wells 2 weeks earlier had not gone unnoticed. In a town where survival often depended on knowing who could be bought, who could be intimidated, and who needed to be eliminated, a young gunslinger with Jesse's reputation represented both opportunity and threat. Sheriff Marcus Kane, the man who ruled Perdition Wells with an iron fist wrapped in a badge that might or might not have been legitimate, had been watching Jesse carefully since his arrival, waiting for the right moment to make his move. That moment came when Pedro Vasquez walked into the Silver Dollar Saloon carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and the desperate hope of a man who had run out of options. Pedro was a simple rancher from the hills south of town, a man whose only crime was owning a piece of land that certain powerful interests wanted to acquire. He had come to Perdition Wells seeking help, unaware that he was walking into a trap that had been months in the making. Sheriff Kane entered the saloon just as Pedro approached the bar, the lawman's heavy footsteps announcing his presence to everyone in the room. Kane was a large man who carried his authority like a weapon, his cold gray eyes missing nothing as they swept the room before settling on his target. At 45, he had built his power through a combination of legal authority and illegal intimidation, turning Perdition Wells into his personal kingdom where he decided who lived, who died, and who simply disappeared into the desert. Jesse Coulter, Sheriff Kane called out, his voice cutting through the nervous silence that had fallen over the saloon. "I've got a job for you." A paying job. Every patron in the saloon turned to look at the young gunslinger who remained seated but alert, his right hand resting casually near his weapon. Jesse had been expecting this moment since his arrival, knowing that Kane would eventually try to use his services for something unsavory. "What kind of job, Sheriff?" Jesse asked, his voice calm despite the tension building in the room. Sheriff Kane smiled, an expression that held no warmth or humor. "The kind that uses your particular talents. See that Mexican fellow over there by the bar? Name's Pedro Vasquez. He's been causing trouble for some good citizens of this territory, stirring up problems over land that doesn't rightfully belong to him. I need you to take care of the situation." The implications of Kane's request were clear to everyone in the saloon. This wasn't about law enforcement or justice. This was about murder for hire, dressed up in the authority of a badge. Pedro Vasquez turned pale as he realized he had walked into a death sentence, his hand tightening on the leather satchel that contained the deed to his family's ranch. Jesse studied the terrified rancher, taking in the man's work-worn clothes, calloused hands and desperate eyes, seeing not a troublemaker but an innocent man who had become inconvenient to the wrong people. "What's his crime exactly?" Jesse asked, though he already knew the answer would be fabricated or exaggerated beyond recognition. Sheriff Kane's smile widened. "Cattle rustling, horse theft, threatening legal landowners. Take your pick. Point is, he's a problem that needs solving, and you're the man to solve it. $500 paid in advance." It was more money than most people in the territory saw in a year, enough to set a man up comfortably for months. But as Jesse looked at Pedro Vasquez, he saw something that reminded him of his own father, a hard-working man trying to protect what little he had built through honest labor. Jesse had killed men before, but they had been gunfighters, outlaws, men who had chosen a violent path and understood the risks. He had never killed an innocent, and he wasn't about to start now. "I'll pass," Jesse said quietly, his words falling into the saloon like stones into still water. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Pedro's labored breathing and the distant whistle of wind through the gaps in the building's weathered walls. Sheriff Kane's expression shifted from confident expectation to dangerous disbelief. "Did I hear you right, boy?" Kane asked, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Did you just refuse a direct order from a duly appointed sheriff?" Jesse stood slowly, his movement deliberate and controlled. "I heard you make an offer, Sheriff, and I declined it. If you want Pedro Vasquez dead for whatever reason, you'll have to find someone else to do your dirty work." The atmosphere in the saloon became electric with tension. Every patron seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see how Sheriff Kane would respond to this unprecedented challenge to his authority. In Perdition Wells, no one refused Marcus Kane, not if they wanted to see another sunrise. But Jesse Coulter was not like most men, and his reputation as a fast gun gave him a protection that ordinary citizens lacked. Sheriff Kane stepped closer to Jesse, his hand resting on the butt of his own weapon. "Let me explain something to you, son. In this town, I am the law. When I give an order, it gets followed. When I make a request, it gets honored. And when I tell someone to do a job, that job gets done. Are we understanding each other?" Jesse met the sheriff's glare without flinching. "I understand you perfectly, Sheriff, but understanding and complying are two different things. I'm not your hired killer, and I won't murder innocent men for money. If that's a problem for you, we can discuss it like gentlemen." His hand moved slightly closer to his gun, a subtle gesture that was not lost on Sheriff Kane or anyone else watching. For a moment, it seemed like the confrontation would escalate into gunplay right there in the saloon. Sheriff Kane was known for his quick temper and quicker draw, but Jesse Coulter's reputation was built on speed and accuracy that few could match. The two men faced each other in the dusty saloon, surrounded by frightened witnesses while Pedro Vasquez watched his fate being decided by strangers. But Sheriff Kane was smarter than his anger. He recognized that killing Jesse Coulter in a fair fight was far from guaranteed, and losing such a confrontation would destroy his authority permanently. Instead, he stepped back and allowed his expression to shift from rage to something far more calculating and dangerous. "I see," Sheriff Kane said slowly, his voice taking on a deceptively calm tone. "Well, Mr. Coulter, I respect a man with principles, even misguided ones. But you've put me in a difficult position. You see, Pedro Vasquez there is going to die today one way or another. That's already been decided by people with more authority than either of us. The only question is how many other people die with him." Jesse felt a chill run down his spine at the sheriff's words. "What do you mean?" Sheriff Kane's smile returned, but now it was the smile of a predator who had found his prey's weakness. "I mean, Mr. Coulter, that your refusal to do a simple job has forced me to make other arrangements. Arrangements that might not be as surgical as your services would have been." The sheriff moved toward the saloon doors, pausing to deliver his final ultimatum. "You have until sunset to reconsider my offer, Jesse. After that, I'll handle the Pedro Vasquez problem my own way. And I promise you, my way will involve a lot more blood than yours would have. Think about that while you're polishing your conscience." Sheriff Kane left the saloon, and the oppressive silence that followed his departure was broken only by Pedro Vasquez's whispered prayers in Spanish and the nervous shuffling of other patrons who suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. Jesse remained standing by his table, his mind racing as he tried to figure out what the sheriff's threat really meant and how he could protect Pedro without starting a war he couldn't win. The young gunslinger had expected consequences for refusing Kane's order, but he had anticipated a direct confrontation, man to man, settled by speed and skill. Instead, he found himself facing something far more complex and dangerous, a situation where his moral stand might have doomed not just Pedro Vasquez, but potentially many innocent people caught in whatever revenge Sheriff Kane was planning. As the afternoon sun slanted through the saloon's grimy windows and the clock on the wall ticked toward evening, Jesse realized that his refusal to kill one innocent man had set in motion events that could lead to far greater tragedy. The question now was whether there was any way to prevent Sheriff Kane from carrying out his threat, or whether Jesse's principles would prove to be not just noble, but ultimately pointless in a town where evil wore a badge and justice was just another commodity for sale. As sunset approached, the atmosphere in Perdition Wells grew thick with anticipation and dread. Word of the confrontation between Jesse Coulter and Sheriff Kane had spread through the town like wildfire, and people began making preparations based on their understanding of how such conflicts usually ended in Marcus Kane's domain. Some shuttered their businesses early, others loaded weapons they hoped they wouldn't need to use, and a few simply saddled their horses and left town, unwilling to be present for whatever was about to unfold. Jesse had spent the hours since Kane's ultimatum trying to convince Pedro Vasquez to leave town, but the Mexican rancher refused to run. "Señor Coulter," Pedro had explained in his careful English, "I have done nothing wrong. My family has owned our land for 3 generations. If I run now, they will take it anyway, and my children will have nothing. At least if I stay, I can make them kill me like a man instead of hunting me like an animal." The rancher's courage was admirable, but potentially suicidal, and Jesse knew that Sheriff Kane was counting on exactly this response. By forcing Pedro to choose between flight and death, Kane was manipulating the situation to his advantage, knowing that a man with pride would choose to stand and fight, making him easier to eliminate while claiming self-defense. But Jesse sensed there was more to the sheriff's plan than simple murder. The threat about other arrangements suggested something larger and more devastating. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the desert sky in shades of red and gold that seemed ominous rather than beautiful, Jesse got his answer. Sheriff Kane appeared on the main street accompanied by 6 men, all heavily armed and wearing the hard expressions of professional killers. Jesse recognized some of them as drifters and gun hands who had been filtering into town over the past few weeks, apparently hired in advance for whatever Kane had been planning. But it wasn't the number of gunmen that made Jesse's blood run cold. It was what they were carrying. Torches, multiple torches already lit and ready to use. Sheriff Kane wasn't planning a simple assassination. He was planning to burn down half the town if necessary to eliminate Pedro Vasquez and send a message to anyone else who might consider defying his authority. "People of Perdition Wells," Sheriff Kane called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air, "we have a situation that requires immediate resolution. A dangerous criminal is hiding among you, threatening the peace and safety of this community. Pedro Vasquez, the man some of you have seen in the saloon today, is wanted for cattle rustling, horse theft, and the murder of 2 ranch hands south of here." Jesse knew the charges were fabricated, but he also knew that most of the townspeople had no way to verify Kane's claims. In a frontier community where survival often depended on supporting whoever held the most power, few would be willing to challenge the sheriff's version of events, especially when that sheriff had 6 armed men backing him up. "Now, I had hoped to handle this matter quietly and efficiently," Kane continued, his gaze seeking out Jesse among the gathered crowd. "But certain individuals have chosen to interfere with the lawful execution of my duties. That forces me to take more comprehensive measures to ensure justice is served." Sheriff Kane gestured to his hired gunmen, and they began spreading out along the main street, taking positions near buildings that housed families, businesses, and innocent people who had nothing to do with the conflict between Kane and Pedro Vasquez. The message was clear. If Pedro didn't surrender himself or if anyone tried to protect him, the entire town would pay the price. "I'm giving Pedro Vasquez one chance to surrender himself peacefully," Kane announced. "If he comes out with his hands up in the next 5 minutes, he'll get a fair trial before a proper judge. If he doesn't, I'll assume he's being harbored by criminal sympathizers, and I'll have to search every building in town until I find him, and you all know how thorough my searches can be." Jesse felt sick as he realized the full extent of Kane's plan. The sheriff was using the threat of burning down the town to force the community to turn against Pedro, making them complicit in his murder by presenting it as a choice between one man's life and everyone's safety. It was psychological warfare at its most vicious, designed to isolate Pedro completely and make his death seem like the responsible choice. From inside the Silver Dollar Saloon, Pedro Vasquez emerged, his hands raised but his head held high. He had clearly heard Kane's ultimatum and made the same calculation Jesse had feared he would make, that his life wasn't worth the destruction of an entire community. "I am here, Sheriff," Pedro called out. "I surrender myself to you. But I tell you again, I am innocent of these crimes you speak of." Sheriff Kane's smile was triumphant as he watched Pedro walk slowly down the street toward him. "That's very wise of you, Vasquez. Very considerate of your neighbors. Now I'm afraid I can't guarantee you'll make it to trial alive. You see these men with me? They lost friends to cattle rustlers like you. They might not be able to control themselves when they see a confessed criminal walking free. The setup was perfect from Kane's perspective. He would claim that Pedro had been killed trying to escape, or that his men had acted in justified anger over his crimes. Either way, the rancher would be dead, his land would be available for acquisition by Kane's associates, and the message would be sent to anyone else who considered defying the sheriff's will. But what Kane hadn't counted on was Jesse Coulter stepping out from the crowd. That's far enough. "Sheriff?" Jesse called out, his hand resting on his gun as he positioned himself between Pedro and Kane's hired killers. "Pedro Vasquez is under my protection now. If you want him, you'll have to go through me first." The young gunslinger's intervention sent a shock through the assembled crowd, and clearly surprised Sheriff Kane, who had expected his threat against the town to neutralize any potential opposition. "Mr. Coulter," Sheriff Kane said, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and regret, "I have to say I respect your principles, but you're making a serious mistake. You can't outdraw 6 men no matter how fast you are, and even if you could, there are innocent people who will get hurt in the crossfire. Is one man's life worth risking all of theirs?" It was the same moral blackmail Kane had used on the town, but Jesse had been thinking about this exact scenario for hours. "You're right, Sheriff. I can't outdraw 6 men at once, but I don't have to." Jesse's voice carried a confidence that made several of the hired gunmen shift nervously. See, the thing about hired killers is that they're not usually willing to die for their employer's ambitions. They're in it for the money, not glory. Jesse addressed the 6 gunmen directly, his words carrying clearly in the evening stillness.
"Any of you boys who want to try me, step forward now.
But understand this, I will kill the first man who draws on me, maybe the second too, if I'm lucky. The question you need to ask yourselves is whether Sheriff Kane is paying you enough to be that first man, because I guarantee you whoever draws first is going to die." The psychological warfare worked both ways, Jesse realized. Just as Kane had used fear to manipulate the townspeople, Jesse could use the hired killer's self-interest against them. These were not men driven by loyalty or principle. They were mercenaries who calculated risks and rewards, and the risk of facing Jesse Coulter in a gunfight was significantly higher than most of them were willing to accept for any amount of money. One by one, the hired gunmen began to back away, their eagerness for confrontation evaporating as they considered the reality of going up against a man with Jesse's reputation. Sheriff Kane watched his carefully laid plan crumble as his mercenaries proved to be exactly what Jesse had said they were. Men motivated by profit rather than courage. "Seems like your boys aren't as committed to your cause as you thought, Sheriff," Jesse observed, his gun still holstered but his stance ready for action. "Maybe you should have offered them more money. Or maybe you should have found men who were willing to die for something other than gold." Sheriff Kane's face darkened with rage as he realized his gambit had failed. But rather than backing down, his humiliation seemed to fuel his determination to see the confrontation through to its violent conclusion. "Fine," he snarled, his own hand moving toward his weapon. "If I can't find men willing to do their jobs, I'll do this myself. You want to protect that murderer so badly. Let's see if you're fast enough to stop me from putting him down like the dog he is." The moment Jesse had been dreading since his refusal that afternoon had finally arrived. Sheriff Kane was drawing his gun, Pedro Vasquez was standing defenseless in the middle of the street, and the entire population of Perdition Wells was about to witness a confrontation that would determine not just who lived and who died, but what kind of place their town would be in the future. Justice or tyranny, law or lawlessness. It all came down to who was faster with a gun in the fading light of a New Mexico evening. Jesse's hand moved to his Colt with the smooth, practiced motion of countless hours of training in too many real gunfights. But as his fingers closed around the familiar pearl grips, he knew that winning this confrontation would only be the beginning of his troubles. Killing Sheriff Kane would make him an outlaw, hunted by every lawman in the territory. But letting Kane live meant allowing the man to continue terrorizing innocent people like Pedro Vasquez. It was a choice between personal survival and moral responsibility, and Jesse Coulter was about to discover which principle mattered more to him when his life was on the line. The main street of Perdition Wells became a theater of death, as Sheriff Kane and Jesse Coulter faced each other across 30 feet of dusty ground. The townspeople who had gathered to watch the confrontation pressed back against the buildings, seeking whatever protection they could find from the violence that was about to erupt. Pedro Vasquez stood frozen between the 2 gunmen, realizing that his fate would be decided in the next few seconds by the speed and accuracy of men he barely knew. Time seemed to slow as both men settled into their stances, hands poised over their weapons. Sheriff Kane had the advantage of experience, having survived dozens of gunfights during his rise to power in Perdition Wells. But Jesse had youth, speed, and something that Kane lacked, the absolute certainty that his cause was just. In that moment before the shooting started, Jesse felt a calm descend over him, the same deadly tranquility that had kept him alive through every confrontation he had faced since leaving Kansas. Sheriff Kane drew first, his hand moving in a practiced blur toward the Colt at his hip. He was fast, faster than most men Jesse had faced, and his gun cleared leather with the smooth efficiency of long experience. But Jesse was faster. His own draw was like lightning, so quick that several witnesses later claimed they never saw his hand move. Only the sudden appearance of the pearl-handled Colt in his grip. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously, the reports echoing off the false-fronted buildings and rolling across the desert beyond the town. Sheriff Kane's bullet whined past Jesse's left ear, close enough to burn but not close enough to kill. Jesse's shot took the sheriff's center mass, the heavy .45 slug punching through his chest and spinning him around before dropping him to the dusty street. The silence that followed was deafening. Sheriff Kane lay motionless in the dirt, his unfired second shot never coming, while Jesse stood with his smoking gun still in his hand, scanning the area for any of Kane's hired men who might try to avenge their employer. But the mercenaries had made their calculation and found it wanting. Without Sheriff Kane to pay them, and facing a man who had just demonstrated his deadly skill, they began to disperse into the gathering darkness. Pedro Vasquez approached Jesse cautiously, his face a mixture of gratitude and awe. "Senor Coulter," he said quietly, "you have saved my life at great cost to yourself. How can I ever repay such a debt?" Jesse holstered his gun and looked around at the assembled townspeople, trying to read their reactions to what had just occurred. Some faces showed relief, others fear, and a few displayed the calculating expressions of people wondering how this change in power might affect them. "You don't owe me anything, Pedro," Jesse replied, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who knew that victory in one battle often led to a larger war. "You were innocent, and killing innocent men is a line I won't cross." Sheriff Kane forgot that his badge was supposed to protect people, not prey on them. Jesse looked down at the body of the man who had terrorized Perdition Wells for years, feeling no satisfaction in the victory, only regret that it had been necessary. Doc Harrison, the town's physician and one of the few people who had openly opposed Sheriff Kane's excesses, pushed through the crowd to examine the fallen lawman. After a brief examination, he looked up and shook his head. "He's dead. Clean shot through the heart." The doctor's announcement seemed to release the tension that had held the crowd in suspended animation, and people began talking in hushed, urgent tones about what would happen next. The question of leadership in Perdition Wells was immediately pressing. Sheriff Kane had ruled through fear and violence, but he had also maintained order of a sort, keeping the various criminal elements in town from turning on each other or preying too openly on legitimate businesses. With his death, that fragile balance was threatened, and everyone knew that chaos could follow quickly if someone didn't step up to fill the power vacuum. Several of the town's business leaders approached Jesse, clearly hoping to convince him to take over as sheriff. Samuel Morrison, who owned the general store, spoke for the group. "Mr. Coulter, we know you didn't come here looking for a job, but the fact is, we need someone who can keep the peace. Someone the bad elements will respect and the good people can trust. You've proven you have the skill and the principles for the job." Jesse considered the offer carefully. Taking the sheriff's badge would give him legal authority and some protection from bounty hunters and territorial marshals who might come looking for the man who killed a lawman. But it would also chain him to Perdition Wells, forcing him to become part of the very system he had been trying to escape when he left Kansas. The irony wasn't lost on him that his refusal to become Sheriff Kane's hired killer might lead to him taking Kane's own position. "I appreciate the offer," Jesse said finally, "but I'm not sheriff material. I'm a drifter, not a town builder. What you need is someone who cares about this place and wants to see it grow into something better than what Kane made it." He looked around at the assembled faces, seeing fear and uncertainty, but also hope for something better than they had known under Kane's rule. Doc Harrison stepped forward, his medical bag still in his hand from examining the dead sheriff. "Jesse's right about not being sheriff material, at least not long-term. But he's wrong about us not needing him right now. The territorial authorities are going to send someone to investigate Kane's death, and when they do, they'll want to know why a duly appointed sheriff was gunned down in the street. We need Jesse here to explain what really happened, and we need time to organize ourselves properly. The doctor's words made sense to Jesse, even though they meant delaying his departure from Perdition Wells indefinitely. He was about to respond when a new voice cut through the discussion, coming from the shadows at the edge of the crowd. I'm afraid Mr. Coulter won't be available for sheriff duties or territorial investigations. A tall man in a black suit stepped into the circle of lamplight, and Jesse felt his blood turn to ice as he recognized the newcomer. It was William Harwick, a federal marshal who specialized in tracking down wanted men across territorial boundaries. Harwick's presence in Perdition Wells could only mean one thing. Jesse's past had finally caught up with him, and his reputation as a fast gun had attracted the attention of law enforcement officials who had long memories and outstanding warrants. Marshal Harwick's appearance changed everything. The townspeople began to back away, sensing that this confrontation was between Jesse and the federal officer, with no room for bystanders. Pedro Vasquez looked confused and frightened, not understanding who this new threat was or what he represented. Jesse kept his hand near his gun but didn't make any threatening moves, knowing that killing a federal marshal would make him a hunted man from coast to coast. Marshal Harwick, Jesse said calmly, though his mind was racing through possible escape routes and defensive positions. I can't say I'm surprised to see you, but I am curious about your timing. You seem to show up at the most inconvenient moments. Harwick smiled, an expression that held no warmth or friendship. It's a talent of mine, Mr. Coulter. I've been tracking you for 3 months. Following reports of a young gunslinger with pearl-handled Colts and a tendency to involve himself in other people's problems. The marshal reached into his coat and produced a folded document, which he held up for Jesse and the townspeople to see. I have here a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of bank robbery, murder, and destruction of federal property, stemming from incidents in Kansas, Colorado, and Arizona territory. You're coming with me, Mr. Coulter, one way or another. Jesse felt the trap closing around him. He had known this day would come eventually, that the mistakes and desperate choices of his past would catch up with him, no matter how far he ran or how many good deeds he tried to balance against his crimes. But he hadn't expected it to happen now, in the aftermath of saving Pedro Vasquez and freeing Perdition Wells from Sheriff Kane's tyranny. Those charges are 3 years old, Marshal, Jesse said, stalling for time while he tried to figure out his options. And some of them aren't exactly accurate. That bank robbery you mentioned? I was trying to stop it, not commit it. The murder charge involves a man who was trying to shoot me in the back, and that federal property was already on fire when I got there. Marshal Harwick's expression didn't change. You can explain all of that to a judge, assuming you live long enough to stand trial. Right now, all I care about is bringing you in alive to face those charges. The question is whether you're going to come quietly, or whether we're going to have another gunfight in this street tonight. Jesse looked around at the faces of the townspeople, seeing fear and uncertainty, but also something else, gratitude and respect for what he had done to free them from Sheriff Kane's oppression. These people were looking to him for leadership and protection, but if he stayed to help them, he would be captured or killed by Marshal Harwick. If he ran, he would abandon them to whatever chaos followed Sheriff Kane's death. It was a choice between personal freedom and moral responsibility, and Jesse realized that his refusal to kill Pedro Vasquez had been only the first test of his character. Now he faced a greater challenge, whether to sacrifice himself for people he barely knew, or to preserve his own life at the cost of abandoning a community that needed him. The answer, when it came to him, was surprisingly clear. Jesse had spent 3 years running from his past, trying to outrun the consequences of choices he had made in desperation and anger. But running had only led him to more violence, more difficult choices, and ultimately to this moment where he had to decide what kind of man he really wanted to be. Marshal Harwick, Jesse said, his voice carrying a resignation that surprised even himself. I'll make you a deal. Marshal Harwick studied Jesse's face carefully, his experienced eyes trying to read whether this was a genuine offer or a desperate ploy for time. I'm listening, Coulter, but I'll warn you right now that I'm not in the mood for tricks or negotiations. You're a wanted man, and my job is to bring you in. That's not open to discussion. Jesse nodded, understanding the marshal's position but hoping to find some middle ground that would protect the people of Perdition Wells while acknowledging his own legal obligations. "I'm not trying to escape justice, Marshal, but these people need protection right now. Sheriff Kane's death has left a power vacuum that could lead to chaos and bloodshed. Give me 1 week to help them establish proper law enforcement, and then I'll surrender myself to you willingly." The townspeople murmured among themselves, some protesting that Jesse shouldn't sacrifice himself, others recognizing the practical wisdom of his proposal. Pedro Vasquez stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had faced death and found his courage. "Marshal, this man saved my life tonight, and he saved our town from a corrupt sheriff who was bleeding us dry with fear and violence. Surely that counts for something in your justice." Marshal Harwick looked around at the assembled faces, taking in the obvious respect and gratitude the townspeople felt toward Jesse. As a federal officer, he had seen many communities torn apart by corrupt local officials, and he recognized the signs of a people who had been living under oppression. What exactly did Sheriff Kane do that was so bad it justified killing him? Harwick asked, genuinely curious about the circumstances that had led to the gunfight. Doc Harrison answered for the group, his medical training having made him a careful observer of human nature and social dynamics. Kane used his badge to extort money from local businesses, intimidate anyone who opposed him, and eliminate people whose property he wanted to acquire. Tonight he was planning to murder Pedro here for the crime of owning a ranch that certain parties wanted to buy cheaply. When Jesse refused to do the killing for him, Kane threatened to burn down half the town to get at Pedro. The marshal's expression grew thoughtful as he listened to the doctor's account. Harwick had dealt with corrupt lawmen before, and he knew how much damage they could do to frontier communities that had no higher authority to appeal to for protection. "Can you prove these accusations?" he asked, and several townspeople began speaking at once, offering testimony about specific incidents of corruption and abuse. Marshal Harwick, Samuel Morrison, interjected, "We have ledgers showing the protection money Kane demanded, witnesses to his threats against honest citizens, and documentation of property transfers that happened under suspicious circumstances. Kane wasn't a lawman, he was a criminal with a badge, and Jesse Coulter did what the territorial authorities should have done years ago." Jesse watched the marshal process this information, hoping that the man's sense of justice would overcome his duty to enforce warrants regardless of circumstances. Harwick had a reputation as an honest officer, but he also had a job to do. And federal marshals didn't usually have the luxury of considering local politics when making arrests. After several minutes of consideration, Marshal Harwick made his decision. "Here's what we're going to do, Mr. Coulter. I'm willing to delay your arrest for 48 hours to allow these people to organize proper law enforcement and document their charges against the late Sheriff Kane. But after that, you're coming with me to face those federal charges, and I'll be staying in town to make sure you don't disappear during that time." It wasn't everything Jesse had hoped for, but it was more than he had expected. 2 days would be enough time to help the townspeople select a new sheriff and establish basic procedures for maintaining order. More importantly, it would allow him to ensure that Pedro Vasquez was truly safe from whatever associates Sheriff Kane might have had outside of Perdition Wells. "That's fair, Marshal," Jesse agreed. "Thank you for considering the circumstances. I give you my word that I won't try to escape during those 2 days." Harwick nodded, recognizing the value of an outlaw's word when it was given freely rather than extracted under duress. In his experience, men like Jesse Coulter were more likely to honor voluntary agreements than forced ones. Over the next 2 days, Perdition Wells underwent a transformation that seemed miraculous to people who had lived under Sheriff Kane's oppression for so long. Without the threat of violence hanging over their heads, business owners began cooperating openly, sharing information about the various criminal enterprises that had flourished under Kane's protection. A town council was formed, with Doc Harrison elected as temporary chairman, and proper procedures were established for selecting a new sheriff. Jesse worked tirelessly during those 48 hours, using his knowledge of frontier law enforcement to help the council draft basic ordinances and procedures. He also took it upon himself to track down and confront several of Kane's associates who might pose a future threat to the community, either convincing them to leave town peacefully or making it clear that their criminal activities would no longer be tolerated. Most chose to depart quietly rather than test whether. Jesse's protection of the town extended to dealing with lingering criminal elements. Pedro Vasquez used the time to gather evidence supporting his legitimate claim to his family's ranch, working with Doc Harrison to document the harassment and intimidation he had faced from Sheriff Kane and his associates. The rancher also made it clear that he intended to testify on Jesse's behalf when the young gunslinger faced federal charges, believing that the man who had saved his life deserved every possible consideration from the justice system. On the morning of Jesse's surrender, a remarkable thing happened. The entire population of Perdition Wells gathered in the main street to see him off, not as spectators at the arrest of a criminal, but as friends bidding farewell to someone who had sacrificed his freedom for their welfare. Women brought food for his journey, men pressed small gifts into his hands, and children who had played safely in the streets for the first time in years waved goodbye with innocent enthusiasm. "Mr. Coulter," Doc Harrison said, "speaking for the assembled townspeople, we want you to know that you'll always have a home here, regardless of what happens with those federal charges. You've shown us what real law enforcement looks like, what it means when someone with power uses it to protect the innocent instead of preying on them. That's a lesson we won't forget." Jesse was moved by the demonstration of support, but he was also realistic about his prospects. The federal charges against him were serious, and even with character witnesses and testimony about his recent actions, he faced the possibility of many years in prison or even execution depending on how a judge interpreted his past crimes. "I appreciate everything you folks are saying," he replied, "but I need you to understand that I might not be coming back. Those charges Marshal Harwick mentioned aren't going to disappear because I did some good here in Perdition Wells." Marshal Harwick, who had been watching the proceedings with professional interest, stepped forward to address the crowd. "I want you people to know that I'll be including a full report about what happened here, including testimony about Sheriff Kane's corruption and Mr. Coulter's actions to protect this community. That doesn't guarantee anything, but federal judges do sometimes consider circumstances when determining sentences." The marshal's words offered a small hope, but Jesse knew better than to count on judicial mercy. He had lived by the gun for too many years, made too many enemies, and accumulated too many regrets to expect that one act of principled behavior would erase his criminal past. Still, as he mounted his horse and prepared to ride toward whatever justice awaited him, Jesse felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace of mind. The journey to Santa Fe, where Jesse would face federal charges, took 5 days through some of the most beautiful and desolate country in New Mexico territory. Marshal Harwick proved to be a surprisingly congenial companion, sharing stories of his years in law enforcement and listening with professional interest to Jesse's account of the events that had led to his life as a wanted man. The marshal made no attempt to judge or condemn, recognizing that frontier justice was often more complex than federal statutes could accommodate. "You know, Coulter," Harwick said on their third day of travel, as they made camp near a small stream in the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, "I've been doing this job for 15 years and I've arrested hundreds of men. Most of them were exactly what their warrants said they were, criminals who deserved whatever punishment they got. But every once in a while I come across someone who ended up on the wrong side of the law through circumstances rather than character." Jesse looked up from the fire he was building, curious about where the marshal's observations were leading. "You think I'm one of those men, Marshal?" Harwick considered the question carefully before answering. "I think you're a man who made some bad choices when you were younger and desperate, then compounded those mistakes by running instead of facing the consequences. But what I saw in Perdition Wells suggests that you've learned something about the difference between justice and revenge, between protecting people and just protecting yourself." The conversation continued late into the night, with Jesse finally telling the complete story of his past crimes, including the circumstances that had driven him to each desperate act. The bank robbery had indeed been an attempt to stop other criminals, but it had gone wrong and resulted in deaths. The murder charge stemmed from a gunfight where Jesse had been defending himself, but against a man with powerful friends who had influenced the investigation. The federal property destruction had been accidental, the result of a fire that spread during another confrontation. Marshal Harwick listened without interrupting, occasionally asking questions for clarification but never challenging Jesse's version of events. When the story was complete, the marshal stared into the fire for a long time before speaking. "You know what your real crime was, Coulter? It wasn't any of those specific incidents. Your real crime was believing that you could handle justice better than the system could. Every time something went wrong, instead of trusting legal processes to sort things out, you took matters into your own hands. The observation was painfully accurate, and Jesse recognized the truth in it immediately. You're right, Marshal. I thought I was smarter than the law, faster than justice, better at deciding right from wrong than judges and juries. It took Sheriff Kane and Pedro Vasquez to show me how wrong I was. Harwick nodded approvingly. The difference between a criminal and a lawman isn't speed with a gun or skill in a fight. It's understanding that real justice requires patience, process, and accountability to something bigger than your own judgment. When they reached Santa Fe, Jesse was surprised to find that his case had generated considerable interest among both legal officials and newspaper reporters. Word of the confrontation in Perdition Wells had spread throughout the territory, and the story of a young gunslinger who refused to murder an innocent man had captured public imagination. Several prominent attorneys offered to represent him without fee, and editorial writers debated whether his recent actions should influence how his past crimes were judged. The federal judge who would hear Jesse's case was Harrison Matthews, a man known for his careful consideration of evidence and his willingness to look beyond simple questions of guilt or innocence to consider broader issues of justice and rehabilitation. Judge Matthews had served on the territorial bench for over a decade, earning respect from both prosecutors and defense attorneys for his fairness and wisdom. The trial lasted 3 days and drew overflow crowds to the courtroom. The prosecution presented evidence of Jesse's past crimes, including witness testimony and documentation that painted a picture of a dangerous outlaw who had left a trail of violence across multiple territories. But the defense countered with testimony from Pedro Vasquez, Doc Harrison, and other residents of Perdition Wells, who described Jesse's refusal to commit murder and his efforts to protect their community from Sheriff Kane's corruption. Marshal Harwick's testimony proved to be crucial, as he described not only Jesse's willing surrender, but also his behavior during their journey to Santa Fe and his complete cooperation with federal authorities. The marshal's professional assessment that Jesse represented a case of circumstances rather than character carried significant weight with Judge Matthews, who had worked with Harwick on many cases over the years. In his closing argument, Jesse's attorney made a passionate plea for mercy, arguing that while his client had indeed committed crimes, they had been the product of youth, desperation, and a misguided sense of justice rather than criminal intent. Your Honor, the attorney concluded, the man who stands before you today is not the same frightened young man who made those terrible mistakes 3 years ago. He has learned the difference between vengeance and justice, between self-interest and service to others. The question before this court is not whether Jesse Coulter committed those crimes. It is whether the man he has become deserves a chance to contribute positively to society. Judge Matthews took 2 days to consider his verdict, during which Jesse remained in the Santa Fe jail, receiving visits from supporters and preparing himself for whatever sentence he might face. When court reconvened, the judge's decision surprised everyone present, including Jesse himself. Mr. Coulter, Judge Matthews began, there is no question that you committed the crimes with which you are charged. The evidence is clear, and your own testimony confirms your guilt. Under normal circumstances, those crimes would require a sentence of no less than 15 years in federal prison, and possibly execution for the murder charge. Jesse felt his heart sink as the judge continued. But Matthews wasn't finished with his statement. However, these are not normal circumstances. The testimony presented in this court suggests that your recent actions in Perdition Wells demonstrate a fundamental change in character and judgment. More importantly, the people of that community have petitioned this court to consider an alternative to imprisonment that would allow you to continue serving their law enforcement needs under federal supervision. The judge's proposal was unprecedented. Jesse would serve a 5-year term as a federally supervised deputy marshal, working specifically in frontier communities that lacked adequate law enforcement. He would be assigned to Marshal Harwick's district, with the understanding that any violation of federal law or abuse of authority would result in immediate imprisonment for the full term of his original sentence. This court believes in redemption, Mr. Coulter, but it also believes in accountability, Judge Matthews concluded. You will have the opportunity to prove that your actions in Perdition Wells represent your true character, rather than an aberration. But you will do so under the watchful eye of federal authority and with the understanding that this court's mercy comes with strict conditions and high expectations. Jesse accepted the judge's terms without hesitation, understanding that he had been given not just a second chance but a path toward genuine redemption. As he took the oath as a deputy federal marshal, he thought about Pedro Vasquez, still farming his family's land in peace, and the children of Perdition Wells, playing safely in streets no longer ruled by fear and corruption. 6 months later, Deputy Marshal Jesse Coulter received his first independent assignment, investigating reports of corruption in a small mining town in Colorado Territory, where a local sheriff was allegedly extorting money from claim holders and eliminating anyone who opposed his authority. As Jesse rode toward his new assignment, his pearl-handled Colts riding easy at his hip and a federal badge pinned to his vest, he smiled at the irony of his situation. He had spent years running from the law, only to discover that his true calling was serving it. His refusal to kill an innocent man had cost him his freedom, but it had also given him something far more valuable, a sense of purpose and a chance to use his skills in service of something greater than his own survival. The young gunslinger who had drifted into perdition, Wells seeking nothing more than a place to hide, had become a man committed to ensuring that places like Perdition Wells could exist without fear of the corrupt officials who preyed on frontier communities. Jesse Coulter had learned that real strength came not from the speed of his draw or the accuracy of his aim, but from the willingness to stand for principle, even when it cost him everything he thought he wanted. And in the end, that lesson had given him everything he actually needed: respect, purpose, and the knowledge that his life had meaning beyond his own survival.